So as Dean Nicholas said, my name's James. I've met quite a number of you, not quite everybody just yet. My role is that I work in the diocese as the principal of the School of Discipleship, which essentially means I try and find any and every opportunity to get the Bible open with people. So it's brilliant to be doing that with you this evening. Our conversations that have led us to this particular programme of things was trying to wonder not only how can we have a good dig into the Bible, but how can we find some stuff which helps us think through some of what we're facing at this particular time. As we go on, if these monthly events work, then we'll think about things to do with economic inequality, what it is to be rich or poor, to do with power and the structures of society that encourage that, well or badly. We'll think about hope, hopelessness, pride and complacency, all sorts of different things which I think we're feeling particularly acutely at the moment. And we thought the Minor Prophets would be a helpful place to go and dig into some of those themes. So that's the idea. But we start tonight in Hosea, the first of the Minor Prophets, really because I think Hosea gives us a bit of a framework for some of those coming months. In one sense, none of those issues are picked up too tightly this evening. But we're starting with a basic framework of who we are and how do we fit, even at this moment, in the unfolding economy of God's story. Who are we? Who is God? How do we relate to him as they're revealed to us in the book of Hosea? That's the idea. Hosea is a wonderful book. It's a fascinating book. It has some of the most complex and complicated Hebrew in the whole of the Bible. It's quite unlike other books similar that you might think would look the same. Lots of unique vocabulary. One of the particular factors is that the Hebrew edition and our English translations have all the verse numbers messed up. So you'll see my beautiful handout that was neat and tidy that I had ready for you. I've had to spend this afternoon scribbling all over it because I got the numbers wrong. But it's an astonishing book. There's all kinds of issues and scholarly debates, if you like that kind of thing, about how we've got this text in this particularly unusual form. But I have to say my favourite explanation of why this is such an unusual book is this. We moved to Southwell a year ago from having lived in Manchester. Now, if you live in Manchester, this is proper south. Okay? I didn't think we were particularly moving south, but it really is. This is the south, if you live up there. And so my favourite explanation of why Hosea is such unusual Hebrew language is because he's a northern prophet. So the idea that he's actually speaking northern. Make of that what you will. That's the language. The book as a whole, you will not find a structural system. You can't break it down into a meaningful overview that makes a logical flow or argument through the book. It teaches us a lot, but if you like nice, ordered sequencing of a closely argued logical development, this isn't going to be your favourite book, I don't think. The flip side of that, of course, is that it is an immensely creative text with some of the best and greatest imagery in the whole of the Old Testament. It's freewheeling, system-defining poetry for us, and I hope we'll see some of that this evening. It's a really small book, but it's immense, and I think it might be helpful for us as we set out on a journey of these evenings together. So here's what we're doing. There we are. We'll start nearly done the overview. We're going to think about the story of the book, and that's going to look at the thing as a big sweep. Then we're going to dig in at one little text and have a go and see if that can help us, and then a couple of bits and pieces to finish. I'm going to try and make it a little bit interactive, just because if you sit here and listen to me for the next hour and a quarter or so, then, well, I think I'm fascinating, but you might not. So from time to time, I'm going to ask you to have a chat with somebody. If you're sat with somebody, you could do that. If you're by yourself, perhaps. If you're willing to, you might stand and go and find someone. Please do remember to keep the distance you need to keep, and it's best if we don't try moving the chairs. But 2 or 3 times through the evening, we'll start with a question in a minute, and we'll stop and just invite you to do that. If that thought horrifies you, and you hate the prospect of interacting with other people, then by all means just sit on your chair and look very serious at the Bible, and never will be too intimidated to approach you. It'll be fine. But actually often, isn't it, it's in talking these things through, not just hearing them go in one way, it's talking them through that helps us process some of the stuff. So that's what we're going to do. Question at the beginning, question at the end, and then we'll stop a couple of times in the middle. So I'd love to start by inviting you to chat to somebody right up front. We asked you whether you have a go at reading all the way through Hosea before you came. Maybe you've done that, maybe you haven't had the chance. If you have, why don't you talk about what you found, what's it about, what do you think it is? If you haven't managed to do that, just share something of what you think might be in a text. Or you could just say, do you know what, I've never read it, I haven't got a clue, that's why I've come tonight. But just to kind of get us going, why don't you find somebody you can talk to and take 2 or 3 minutes to chat through together. What do you think is the big thing? What's the big idea of the book of Hosea? Let me just read you a quote. This is on your handout there. This is from a little book on Hosea by Tim Chester. He writes, "In the message of Hosea, we see the passion of God. We see the jealousy of God, the commitment of God, the heartbreak of God, the enthusiasm of God, and the love of God. People often talk about what they feel about God. The book of Hosea tells us what God feels about us." You okay with that as a quote, having looked through some of Hosea? Does it chime with what you've read? The thing is about that quote, they're all relational words, aren't they? Jealousy, commitment, heartbreak. You can't do those things without a relational object. You can't commit unless there's someone or something that you're going to commit to. You're only jealous of a person. Hearts don't break without reference to someone or something. And so for me, here's the first main reason why I think this is such an electric little book for us just at this time. I don't know how you've experienced the last 6 months. It's been a whole range of different things for people, hasn't it? For some, this has been a period of intense isolation. Others may have found the pressures of being on top of one another for such an extended period of time a bit too much. We know that mental health has suffered and domestic abuse has risen. And even if none of those extremes have been your experience, even if you've enjoyed some of the upsides, a slower pace of life, less traffic and pollution, more walks out in the countryside, I'm sure even your nerves have frayed from time to time, haven't they? There have been some human contacts you've missed, others that you've worried about. So how are we intended to relate to one another and above all, relate to the God who made us? How can we understand that idea? What's the image we can feast our eyes upon which would show us the passion of a true, a real, the right relationship? Well, right at the end this evening, we're going to pick up a little bit more some of the fantastically brilliant imagery in Hosea. But this quote, I think, picks up the overwhelmingly dominant image of the book, which is that of a marriage. And in Hosea, it's a marriage between one endlessly faithful and one pathologically unfaithful partner, isn't it? That's the big deal of the book. Well, I want to very slightly reshape that understanding a bit this evening, and I think digging into it will help us do that, because you see that sense of the book comes perhaps most clearly from 2 little story episodes in Hosea. If you start with Hosea chapter 1, verse 1, in my Bible that's on page 648, but that won't help you at all, will it? But Hosea chapter 1, verse 1 locates us in the nation of Israel, Old Testament Israel, the people of God, after the nation has split in two. So after King David, after King Solomon, there's this great division in the nation. But it happens before the northern half, to which most of the book is addressed, gets carried off into exile. So this is one of the last moments in the Old Testament where you still have one Israel, although split in two. We're about to lose most of it and lose it for good. That's where we are. That's what chapter 1, verse 1 does for us as a single verse. But then from chapter 1, verse 2 through to verse 9, we've got a little narrative episode. And then again, chapter 3, all of it, provides the second story episode. And if we're honest, if anyone knows anything about the book of Hosea, it's usually these 2 little story chunks. But bear in mind, between them, they contribute only 15 verses to a book of 197. That is, these 2 stories make up less than 10% of the book. So we need to look a little bit more deeply. And I think as we do, we're going to find we've got the basic idea, the dominant image right, but we might be able to say something even more significant, even more powerful. In fact, despite all the judgment and awfulness of what Hosea makes us face, and there's plenty of that, isn't there? There's something even more encouraging about the message and the purpose of the book. So are you up for that this evening? Should we give that a go? Right, well, let's not despise what we do know. Let's make sure we've got a good understanding of that extraordinary story. So the narrative, chapter 1. So chapter 1, verse 2 gives us the whole picture. Just in case you're the kind of person that will worry, we're not going to move at an even speed throughout the book of Hosea this evening. We only get about as far as chapter 4, and we might glance on past that. In case you're worried, it's going to be this slow. But Hosea the prophet is told at the beginning of Yahweh speaking to take for himself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. Well, there's nothing hidden there, is there? He's to marry a prostitute and have children with her. It's pretty blunt. It's pretty strange, but it's direct instruction, isn't it? And the second half of the verse tells us why. Take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, because the land has surely whored away from Yahweh. So we've got the whole narrative of the book set up and explained straight away. This is to be the dominant image of Hosea's life, and it's to represent, to communicate, to illustrate, to demonstrate, to point out, to be a visual aid of the dominant image in the relationship between God and his people. Yes? Go take yourself a wife of whoring and children of whoring, for the land has surely whored away from Yahweh. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Because in our context, this will put Hosea out of action, isn't it? You don't need me to highlight any of the many recent controversies in which a moral failure of a prominent Christian leader has brought a church to its knees or brought dishonour to the gospel. And of course, elsewhere, Scripture's got plenty to say about the requirements of those in church leaderships, not at least in terms of how they lead their own households. But that's not quite what's going on in Hosea, is it? One commentator puts it like this. He says, Hosea's experience with the promiscuous Gomer, that's the wife that he takes, Hosea's experience with the promiscuous Gomer has actually legitimated his call to be Yahweh's prophet. What many will consider disqualification for the office, a prophet whose own wife was morally out of control, serves in this case precisely as his credentials. And that's because of who this message is spoken to, isn't it? That is, by the end of the story, both Yahweh and Hosea have visibly lived out the shared experience of marriage to an unfaithful spouse. And that's what gives Hosea's prophecy its real power. But the story goes on, and interestingly, with instant obedience. I don't know how you would receive that kind of message. Verse 2, go marry a whore and have children. Verse 3, and he went and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. In fact, in due time, she's going to bear him 3 children, and they all have these desperate names. First, a boy called Jezreel. Second, a girl called Not Pitied. And third, a boy called Not My People. Deeply unpromising, isn't it? Notice as well, there's absolutely no extraneous detail in a text, which is unusual. Normally, at this point, you'd have something like, he took Gomer and he lay with her, or he went into her, which, by the way, may I say, is how Hebrew works. That particular phrase is immensely graphic. He went into her and she conceived. Our English translations are oh so refined and clean it all up for us. The Hebrew is usually telling you in very clear language the mechanics and the earthiness of the encounter. But not here. All of that's missed out. None of the usual phrases. Instead, everything rushes on to the names. All the other details of the common language, they get left out. Just get to the names, because the names are the thing. And so the name of the firstborn is a name which speaks of judgment. I don't know whether you know anything about Jezreel. It's a place. It's a prime battle site, actually. It's a great plain, one of the largest plains in the region, which means you can have your chariots ride all around it. So that's pretty hard to do in the hilly places. And as such, for example, it was the site of Jehu and his great victory. So Jehu, you might not know about him, you can read about it later, if you like, in 2 Kings and chapter 9. But he was swept to power over all Israel on an overwhelming tide of bloodshed. The essence of the story is that his accession to the throne has been blessed by the prophet Elisha. Even the shedding of blood to achieve it was accepted. And yet the force and the vigour with which his army slaughtered their opponents has now in the land become a byword for godless self-reliance. That's Jezreel. When you hear Jezreel, what you're thinking is godlessness, self-reliance, total destruction. And that's Hosea's first child. The great plain of Jezreel, it's also one of the sites designated for the execution of judgment. So if you're justly sentenced to any form of punishment, you'd often be to such a place as this, that you'd be brought out for the sentence to be carried out. In fact, the word Jezreel carries a sense of judgment even within it. It can mean God will scatter, as in what you do with chaff or with anything that needs disposal. It means destroy. Fascinatingly, though, Jezreel can also mean God will scatter, as in what you do with seed. And again, don't blush at the coarseness of the language. Yes, you scatter seeds of wheat to grow grain, but men also scatter a different kind of seed, don't they? And so a little bit later on, in a chapter or two's time, we'll come back to God doing that kind of scattering as he speaks of populating, of inseminating his people in restoration. So in this name, there's the tiniest hint of hope, but for now, the child is named for a place of judgment, and his sister, not pitied for God's refusal to show mercy to her. And the youngest brother, not my people, for God's disowning of this wayward family. Can you see? Hosea has entered into a deep disgrace, patterning the infidelity of the nation within his own household. And his children are named by the proper response of the holy and righteous God to that infidelity, judgment, the withholding of mercy, and eventually a disowning. And that's largely story episode number 1. Now, you'll notice the very end of chapter 1 and into chapter 2, verse 1, much more positive. It's fascinating to know that as soon as this enacted parable, this visual aid, speaks of God's judgment and sentence upon his people, there's a little glimmer of hope. It's never absent in Hosea, even if it's rare. For then from verse 2 onwards, we're back to condemnation and sentence. We'll look at that later. So that's the first episode of the story. Then Hosea has married a publicly immoral and unfaithful woman. They've had children. That would have been immensely painful and deeply shaming. But look what's happening in chapter 3. I wonder if you spotted what's going on there. God speaks a second time to Hosea, this time saying, "Go and love a woman who has a lover and is acting as an adulteress." Well now, who do you assume this woman is? It's Gomer again, isn't it? If Hosea is now going to take another wife, then he becomes the unfaithful and immoral. Now, Gomer, having been with Hosea, having borne him these 3 children, has now returned to her old life. She's fallen for another man. She took him for a while as her lover and is whoring herself out again on the open market. So this time, Hosea has to go and look, chapter 3, verse 2, he has to go and buy her back. Can you imagine the quite extraordinary scandal of it? What the good folk of Israel would think of him. It's not as if this is some sort of quiet affair. He just nips around to have a word and get things sorted out. He's already famous in the land for having taken such an infamous woman in the first place. Now she's flouted his goodness and kindness, has publicly taken up with someone else, and basically is back in the brothel. Things have fallen so low, he even has to go to the brothel himself and pay a homer and a half of barley to be able to take his own wife, the mother of his children, back into his own home. That's costly. And you see the lengths Hosea has to go to for the sake of his faithfulness in this relationship. Can you begin to see why he does it? It's a visual aid, remember, for God's relationship to his people. Well, that's the story. That's the kind of broadest view of what's going on. So I'm going to shush for a few moments and give you some chance just to process, catch up with yourselves and your thinking. Just think over the story. We'll look at some of the poetry in a moment. But just think of some of the story. What does that teach us? What are the thoughts that are coming into your head as you're reflecting on what Hosea is doing for Gomer, or with Gomer, and how Gomer is responding? What does that make you think of? And particularly, how does that help us think about being God's New Testament people in the light of the story? Why don't you have a conversation together for a few more minutes? Well, shall we come back together? I don't know what your conversation was. We can perhaps pick that up another time. The point, though, is that God has gone to these lengths for us, isn't it? And the price that he had to pay for us as his people, it wasn't a homer and a half of barley. It was the life of the Lord Jesus, of his one and only precious Son. God's faithfulness to us is seen in that giving. His determination, despite our rejection of his covenant, was to buy us back and bring us home. So if in these times we're worrying that God is oddly silent, or we're feeling terribly alone, we're at sea in a world we can't quite make sense of, does the book of Hosea have something to say which might help us? Is there a bigger story in which we can set our worries and our anxieties? Is there a surer hope of a God who will even undergo the giving of the life of his Son? The greatest humiliation, born out of love for his faithfulness to, for his everlasting commitment with his people, however faithless we may be. It's an astonishing image, isn't it? Which I think only gets more powerful the longer you dwell on it. So how would you face a COVID lockdown, a post-lockdown, a sort of lockdown? I don't even know what this is anymore. How would you focus one of these days if you knew that that's who God is? That that's how God is. Endlessly faithful, even to a pathologically unfaithful spouse. Would that shape how you approach each day, seeing the nature and the scale and the passion of God for his people? Would that colour how you interact with others? Would it bend the arc of your hope toward a different kind of future, the kind of future which breaks in and even now transforms the present? I think it mightn't it? If we dwell for long enough on that image of the endlessly faithful God. Anyway, that's the story, perhaps the bit that people are familiar with. Because of some of these questions, I think we could probably pause there. We've got enough to chew on for the rest of the week. Go home and think on that, couldn't we? But you're here. I want to suggest Hosea's got even more for us than that. So if that's the big overview, we're going to dig in for a moment at a small little section. You see, if we're not living in the fullness of God's blessing, if we're too often dwelling in a world which feels harsh and hopeless, if we're not truly realising the extent of God's passionate, even his fiercely passionate love for us, then we need to push a bit harder, don't we, to make sense of what's going on. So let's have a look at chapter 2. You see, Hosea doesn't just speak judgment on Israel's unfaithfulness. Hosea clearly maps out why she's been unfaithful and what the implications have been. I'm going to map out a bit of chapter 2 as an illustration. I'm interested in chapter 2 verses, I've written the wrong numbers down again, 2 to 13 I think, which it seems to me is a self-contained prophecy. Let me just show you one or two features. Chapter 2 and verse 2, note, just for a moment, the whoring face. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I'm not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts. Now, I take it that's the rich makeup and the jewel adornment which was designed to make her appealing to her potential customers. Just note that in passing, and then see her failure as we move on. Because can you picture the imagery? We've got a profoundly promiscuous female body, that's the made-up face, the fragrance between her breasts. Then by the end of verse 3, there's a shift to a different metaphor. Now the picture is that of a barren wilderness. Now, just pause for a moment. These are not the pictures we should have of Israel, are they? This is not the way we should think of God's special and chosen people. They're supposed to be a holy, a life-giving people. People who bring succour and comfort and vigour to the nations around them as they point them to holiness and truth. And yet, instead of being a holy, life-giving people, they're painted as a nude prostitute or a barren desert. It's grim, isn't it? Well, not only do we know that she has failed, sorry, I'm all behind. Crucially, we know how she's failed. Verse 5. She said, "Let me go after my lovers who give me my bread and water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my ointments." In what does Israel's unfaithfulness consist? In her running to others for the things which God himself provides. Do you see? Look, that begins with the essentials of life. She's gone to others for bread and water. It then progresses through wool and flax, that's clothing, to the sheer luxuries of oil and whatever that word is. Your translation probably has drink, does it? Yeah. But she's gone for the basics as well as to the luxuries. Where? To someone else. So verse 6, where does that leave her? It leaves her utterly lost, doesn't it? She can't see where she's going. She's hedged in. There's a wall in front of her. She can't find her way. All through verse 6 and into verse 7. So blinding and debilitating does this become, that eventually she runs face first into the realization that her first husband is where all this should have come from. She's realized it. She should go back to Yahweh. Do you see the pattern? She fails because she looks elsewhere, so eventually she is so blinded by her sin and her failure that she can see nothing. And so then Hosea presents the truth in verse 8. Actually, it was always and only ever God who provided the things she's been so running after. From the essential grain, yes, to the luxury oil, all things come of thee, O Lord. But even more, I gave her silver and I gave her gold. And so there's a sentence for her unfaithfulness. I will now remove all these things from her. You've gone to get them from someone else, and I shall take them from you. What's the implication of that? Well, she has reached a point where she can no longer see clearly, but now her lovers, all those with whom she's prostituted herself, they will see her very clearly. And when that hideous image is seen, no man shall save her. Nobody will be attracted to a real, truthful vision of what an infidel she has become. Which ends the prophecy in this awful picture of Israel's destruction. There's no rejoicing, all the festivals have gone, the vines have withered. She's merely scrubland, devoured by beasts. Why all of that? Well, I will make a reckoning, verse 13, against her for the days of the Baalim, the time of her chasing after the other gods, when she put on her nose and jewellery, because of her face of whoring. Can you see the extraordinary symmetry and patterning of what's going on within this poem? The dominant image is still the dominant image. It's the unfaithful wife. But in this extraordinary poetry, Hosea is showing us actually the definition of unfaithfulness. It's trusting anyone for the things which God alone has committed himself to give. And actually how the running after those things blinds us to reality. And as it blinds us to reality, it reveals us to the world outside as washed out, repellent sinners. You see, when we claim to trust the Lord, but really trust our bank account, or our good job, or our nice home, or our own clever strategies for managing life, well, the picture our own lives paint comes to be a horrible perversion that attracts nobody to come in to the household of God. That's the message, isn't it? Where the truth is always right at the heart of this, and it's so simple, if only we could remember that God gives us far more than we could ever ask or imagine. That's his side of the marriage relationship. If only our hearts could remember that. We're going to pause there again just for a moment. My questions tonight for you are very specific. I want to leave you some room just to make of this what you can. But does this help? What strikes you? We looked at the big picture, that's what we were talking about before. Now we've dug into something, and I think that's unearthed for us something about what's gone wrong in this relationship, how it's happened, and what the consequences have been for the mission of God's people, as well as for the individuals within the household of God. Just have another few moments with one another. What strikes you? What's kind of catching your mind and your interest just at the minute? And what are you hoping you might find as we look on into some more of Hosea? Well, you have one more brief chat together. One of the things that constantly strikes me is that the more closely we look at Scripture, the more we learn, however well we think that we know it, however long we've spent studying already. And the deeper we dig, the richer a scene we find. Isn't that true? And what have we seen so far? We've had the first episode of story, which sets up this image of unfaithfulness with the essential focus on the naming of the children. Then this prophecy in chapter 2, which unfolds our understanding of what that unfaithfulness looks like, where it leads to. But flip on a little bit, running up to the next story episode, and what do we see? Well, we turn in the second half of chapter 2 to God's promise to restore Israel. Chapter 2, verse 16, there's a brilliant pun in the Hebrew. It shall be on that day, said Yahweh, she shall call me my husband, and no longer call me my Baal. And Baal is generally the name given to a foreign god. She shall call me my husband, and no longer my Baal. Now the pun is untranslatable, but Baal is both the name of the Canaanite god and another, is slightly obscure, but another Hebrew word for husband. So I will take away the names of the Baalim from your mouth. They shall no longer be called by your name. And once again, I shall be your husband. So these names of the foreign gods or husbands, the ones with whom Israel has been prostituting herself, they'll be taken away and remembered no more. But we still have the problem, don't we? The children with the awful names. Or at least we still have that problem until the marriage between the Lord and his people is restored. Verses 19 and 20 in chapter 2, can you see? Yahweh says, I will betroth you, I will betroth you, I will betroth you, or something like, I will take you for my wife forever, I will take you for my wife in righteousness and in justice, I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahweh. Know him, yes, understand him, but also know him with the kind of intimacy with which a man knows a woman. Our culture might indeed say no in the biblical sense, draw into true communion with. Anyway, these children with the awful names, now that the parents are once more betrothed, taken as spouses, what happens by the end of chapter 2 and 3's prophecy? Well, chapter 2 and verse 23, in Jezreel, God will scatter, this time a sowing of seed scattering, so restoring and populating Jezreel instead of judging Jezreel. And I will have pity on not pitied, and I will say to not my people, you are my people. And, critically, he shall say to me, you are my God. Do you see, the story episode sets up the prophecy in its deepest sense, illustrates, makes the communication of God's purposes plain. There's judgment in the naming at the start. Marriage the first time round. There's infidelity in the prophecy we've seen, that's definition and its consequences. There's a second betrothal, and following that, there's a restoration, the renaming. Not pitied becomes pitied. Not my people becomes my people. And Jezreel now, instead of being judgment, is hope, is repopulating, fashioning again. The depth of what God feels as Hosea understands those feelings of God's anguish and pain can never be separated from the height of who he is. The sharpness of the pain that registers in the divine complaint is directly related to the majesty, to the perfection of the person who is suffering. And that language of suffering takes on its pathos from the familial relationship which controls Hosea's prophecy. No shepherd could feel that pain over their sheep. no judge over his defendant, no king over his subjects, spouses and parents, no special kinds of pain, not until Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, endures the betrayal of his disciple, and complains against the withdrawal of the Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? Not until then do we see a clearer picture of wounded majesty. And yet the astonishing hope for each and every one of us is that this is a majesty who will walk eyes open with clear sight into the midst of all this pain and brokenness to redeem, to bring home the ones he loves. Isn't that extraordinary? I want to ask you one more question, and then I'm all done. It's Monday morning, tomorrow. Somebody asks you what you did at the weekend, and oddly you say, I went to Southwell Minster last night. And I sat for an hour or so listening to someone talk about the book of Hosea. A day. They say to you, well, what's that all about? Just spend a moment telling your partner you've been chatting to this evening what you're going to tell them.